I wrote these essays, and I realize we've mentioned them a few times. They're an analysis of the malfunctioning of the press in Israel. And I gave a lot of examples about the scope of coverage. For example, we had more reporters when I was at the AP covering Israel than we had covering the entire continent of Africa, south of the Sahara. That's 50-something countries. We had more people in Israel. Israel is 1/100th of 1% of the world's surface. Sometimes I say, we covered Israel more than we covered China. And if I'm speaking to Jews, people just look at me blankly. Because of course, people don't like the content of the coverage, but they think the scope is completely rational. But if we understand that the news is a rational attempt to understand events on planet Earth, then you cannot cover Israel more than 1.3 billion people in India, which we did. And I could go on, and that was part of what the article was about. But it really was about, in retrospect, something that was happening across the press corps, and not just in the press corps. It was happening across liberal institutions. You mentioned the academy. Human rights, NGOs, the ACLU, pillars of the liberal West in the past 20 years or so, 15 years.
The International Criminal Court.
The ICC, arms of the United Nations. They've been kind of gutted by activists and repurposed.
Yes.
And they fly under the same names, which makes it very confusing, but they are fundamentally different institutions with different goals. And that's what I was surprised to find at the AP, that many of the people making decisions, not everyone in the Bureau, but many of the people making decisions were activists. And they weren't interested in explaining a complicated reality. They were interested in swaying readers toward the correct political conclusion. And if that is your goal, then you choose completely different stories and you present them in a completely different way. So if in Israel, the idea is to sway people towards supporting the cause of justice, that is the Palestinians, then any story that makes Israel's position seem reasonable, they can't be reported, and I have examples of that. And any story that makes the Palestinians seem reasonable, then you report it, inflate it, and that's a big cause of the misunderstanding. But it's not limited to Israelis and Palestinians. It's true of American politics, it's true of gender, it's true of the origins of COVID. There are many, many examples where the press really dropped the ball, and that's what I was trying to do in those essays. Did they have an impact?
Did they have an impact?
Since I wrote those essays in 2014, press coverage of Israel has been superb.
Exactly.
Everything, people just read those essays and they said, you know what? This Canadian guy, he's right. And they changed everything. Since then, it's been too positive in my opinion.
It really has.
It didn't make a difference, and I really felt like I was a guy in a rowboat, kind of whacking the side of the aircraft carrier, and no one noticing. But what did happen is that not because of the essays, but because this was happening in a context where a lot of people were losing faith in the institutions. Just I think, unfortunately, quite rightly, that those institutions have lost a lot of their clout. And people can read these essays and kind of explain to themselves why this is happening on one particular story that's of interest to me and to people in this room. So it has had an effect in this new world where a lot of people are just wandering. A lot of centrist, sane people are wandering around homeless, buffeted by misinformation of different kinds, and they're kind of grasping at information that seems reasonable to them. And some people found those essays 10 years ago, and a lot of people, I think, have found the Free Press, which you founded. And it's kind of, we're all swimming toward islands in the ocean, and we're finding each other, and we're discovering that actually a lot of people are swimming in the ocean, and that there are people who are trying to address this problem. So I think it's part of the same process.
One of the things that I have thought a lot about over the past year is you mentioned how institutions like Harvard still has the Harvard name, the New York Times still has the really beautiful font, but the content of it is completely different. And yet the pursuit of truth has nothing to do with what Harvard is about. One of the things that has struck me as sort of like a tragedy of the American Jewish story is the fact that there are so many Jewish names affixed to the buildings of those places. Museums, universities, we could go on and on and on. But what accounts for that? What accounts for, is this something about Jews that we're flawed in this way, that we sort of like the idea of throwing our support behind places that were like creating ideas that were literally coming to swallow us alive and seeming to either be ignorant about it or kind of okay with it? What explains that tendency?
This is a very philosophical question, and I think there are people in this room who are far better equipped to answer it than I am. I live in Israel, which presents me with a whole list of problems, but it saves me a whole list of other problems that you guys have to deal with, like, what's going on in the library that my family donated to whatever university, a generation or two ago. But it's a real phenomenon, and there is, just looking at this in a deeper way, there is a kind of a repeating historical phenomenon where Jewish stories and ideas are turned against Jewish people. So I think you can look at the roots of Christianity and you'll see some of that there, where Jewish books become, the Jews are kind of pushed out of the story that they wrote, and it's turned against them, and they become the antagonists of ideas that they had promoted. I think you can see it in Holocaust education. Anyone who was following the events in Ireland last week saw Holocaust commemoration essentially turned against the Jews, who, of course, tell the story of the Holocaust but don't understand it. The Jews don't understand the story of the Holocaust. They think it's about them.
But it's about the Palestinians.
Actually, it's about the Palestinians and about the victims of power, including Jewish power. Someone who's written about this beautifully is Darrell Horn, who is one of my favorite writers and a friend, and who's written for the Free Press. And she's written about a discomfort in, of course, Jews donated a lot of money for Holocaust education, built Holocaust museums, made Holocaust movies, and in a lot of these museums, there's a profound discomfort with the centering of the Jewish story. The Holocaust is supposed to be a generic lesson about injustice. And if you promote your own particularism in these places, you're missing the point. So there's a recurring phenomenon. You can talk about communism, and there are other examples where there are ideas that Jews think will contribute something to the world, that will improve their place in the world, and those ideas or buildings or institutions are turned against them. I mean, Human Rights Watch, founded by a Jew, Amnesty, founded by kind of a Jew who converted to Catholicism. But I mean, these institutions, and there are many more examples of institutions that are founded
International human rights law.
International human rights law, the term genocide.
Raphael Lemkin.
Right. And these are all, Jewish contributions to humanity, or so the contributors believed, but they're turned against the Jews, who don't understand
the very ideas they've come up
with. This is a recurring theme in Western history.
Hey guys, Barry here. I hope you enjoyed that clip from the latest episode of Honestly. If you want to watch the full conversation and support the work that we do here at the Free Press of fearless, independent journalism, subscribe today at the top link in this video's description, or just go to thefp.com/join.